This happened to me when I was still a police officer in a small town, the kind where everyone knows each other and nothing truly scary ever happens. It was a cold autumn afternoon, the kind of day where the sky stays overcast but never quite rains. I was in my patrol car, finishing a lukewarm coffee when the call came over the radio. A woman was hysterical on the phone, saying her child had vanished from the car while she was shopping. I hit the gas, trying to brace myself for what I was about to find. Most of the time, in cases like these, the kid just unbuckles their seatbelt and hides in the back seat or something like that. But from the sound of the mother's voice, I already knew this was different. When I arrived, I found the woman pacing in circles next to her car, her hands on her head, eyes wide with panic. The car, a silver sedan, still had its back door slightly open. "I swear it was just a minute," she kept repeating, as if trying to convince herself. "He was asleep. I locked the door. I know I locked it." But there it was, the door ajar, and her 2-year-old son was gone. No broken glass, no signs of a struggle. Just an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. The first thing I did was call for backup. The grocery store didn't have cameras outside, only inside at the checkout lanes. Whoever took the child either knew that or got incredibly lucky. A few customers were still around, but no one had seen anything. An older man said he thought it was odd to see the car door open, but assumed someone was just loading their groceries. No witnesses, no leads. I scanned the area, trying to imagine how it happened. A stranger silently opening the door, pulling a sleeping toddler out, and vanishing without anyone noticing. This didn't seem like a typical abduction. We spent the first few hours searching everywhere: alleys, parking lots, nearby yards. No trace of the child. Every passing minute made the case feel more sinister. Then, just as the sun was setting and we were beginning to fear the worst, my radio crackled with an update. A woman from another neighborhood had called the police, saying she had found a toddler alone on the sidewalk, wrapped in an adult's coat. He was cold but unharmed. My heart pounded. How did he end up so far away? Who had taken him? And more importantly, why? I arrived at the given address within minutes. It was a quieter neighborhood, with wide streets and spaced-out houses, the kind of place where people lock up early for the night. The woman who found the toddler looked unsettled, still holding the little boy in her arms when I pulled up. He was wrapped tightly in a dark coat that was clearly too big for him. I went outside to take out the trash and saw him standing there, right in the middle of the sidewalk, she said, her voice trembling. He wasn't crying. He just kept looking around, like he was waiting for someone to come get him. That gave me chills. A 2-year-old doesn't act like that. They cry, panic, call for their parents. But this one, he was silent. I picked up the child, feeling the warmth of the coat. It had a strange scent, not cigarettes, perfume, or anything familiar. It smelled dry, cold, like an old basement that hadn't been opened in years. The boy didn't resist when I placed him in the patrol car. He just stared at the window with wide eyes, gripping a small piece of the coat between his fingers. But something about him unsettled me. He wasn't talking. Not a word. Not a single sound. Even scared children usually cry when they're found, but not him. He just held onto that coat like it was something precious. We took the boy back to his mother, who collapsed in relief the second she saw him. She hugged him so tightly, kissing his forehead over and over while I watched, a lump forming in my throat. "Where were you, baby? Who took you?" But he just rested his head on her shoulder, still clutching the coat. When she tried to pull it off him, he gripped it even tighter, as if he couldn't let it go. That bothered me. Whoever had taken him made sure he was warm, made sure he was safe. But at the same time, they took him from a busy grocery store parking lot and left him alone in an empty neighborhood. We investigated everything. No cameras caught anything. No suspicious vehicles were reported in the area. The woman who found him didn't see anyone nearby before he appeared. It was as if he had just been placed there without a trace. We took the coat in for analysis, But there were no fingerprints, no fibers, no clues that could lead us to who had left him. Just one single detail that still haunts me to this day. When I asked the boy, weeks later, if he remembered who took him, he finally spoke. In a quiet, distant voice, he whispered, "The tall man. The tall man." Those words stuck with me for days. We asked the mother if her son usually made up stories or had fears about anything specific, but she said no. He was a quiet, bright kid for his age, and he had never mentioned anything like that before. We tried asking him more questions, but he wouldn't say anything else. He just kept holding on to that coat whenever he could, like it was some kind of safety blanket. Time passed, and even after multiple interviews, forensic tests, and increased patrols in the area, we never figured out who took him or why. No suspects, no clues. It was as if the whole thing had happened without leaving a single trace. The following months were strange. The mother called me a few times, saying her son had started having nightmares. He would wake up crying, saying the tall man was at the window, watching him. But whenever she ran to check, no one was there. She tried taking the coat away from him a few times, but he refused to sleep without it. And then, one night, something even more bizarre happened. She woke up in the middle of the night to a noise in the living room. When she went downstairs, she found the front door unlocked and the coat neatly folded on the couch. Her son was still asleep in his bed, but this time without holding on to the coat. The next morning, he didn't even ask for it. After that, the nightmares stopped. The boy went back to normal, as if nothing had ever happened. His mother donated the coat, saying she didn't want it in the house anymore, and life moved on. I continued my career in law enforcement for several more years, handling all kinds of strange cases, but this one stayed with me in a different way. What unsettles me isn't just how the child disappeared without a trace, or the fact that we never found anyone responsible. What truly disturbs me is the feeling that whoever took that boy didn't mean to harm him. They wanted to take care of him, protect him, and maybe, just maybe, they were waiting for the right time to bring him back. To this day, whenever I drive through that neighborhood at night, sometimes I get the sense that something is standing in the corner of my eye. A shadow, taller than it should be, motionless between the trees. I know it's probably just my imagination, but there are moments when I can't shake the feeling that that little boy was never really in danger. But whoever took him might still be watching. I've been working as a night security guard at a storage facility for about a year now. It's usually a quiet job, sometimes even boring. Most people rent these units to store old furniture, family keepsakes, or inventory for their businesses. At night, almost no one comes around. My job is mostly walking through the empty corridors, checking that all the padlocks are intact, and making sure no one's lurking around. I usually bring a book or listen to podcasts to pass the time, but that particular night felt strangely silent. Not even the wind howled outside. My first patrol of the night started like any other. I grabbed my flashlight, made my usual rounds, and didn't notice anything out of place, until I heard the noise. It was muffled, something between a knock and a scratch, coming from one of the farthest corridors. I stopped, held my breath, and waited to hear it again. And I did. 3 dull thuds, spaced apart. Then silence. I checked my radio, but I was the only guard on duty that night. This had happened before. Rats, wind pushing some loose panel, things like that. But something about this sound made me uneasy. I followed the noise, shining my flashlight down the rows of identical metal doors. They all looked the same, one after the other, like I was walking through a labyrinth. Then I noticed something strange. The sound was coming from one of the units, but the padlock was intact. That ruled out the possibility of an intruder. Maybe an animal had gotten trapped inside? But how? I stood there for a few seconds, listening. Then it happened again. This time, louder. 3 knocks followed by a faint, muffled whimper. A chill crawled up my spine. I knew I wasn't supposed to open any unit on my own, company policy, but something in my gut told me something was very wrong. I grabbed my radio and called the police. I explained the situation as professionally as I could, but I could hear the tension in my own voice. They said they'd send a unit over and instructed me to stay nearby, but not to touch anything. So I waited, standing alone in that narrow corridor, staring at that metal door as if it was about to open on its own. The wait felt endless. Every minute, the silence in the corridor seemed to grow heavier, pressing down on me. I kept staring at the door, half expecting to hear another noise, but everything had gone eerily quiet. That only made me more uneasy. I took a few steps back, trying to shake off the feeling that maybe I was overreacting, that maybe it was just some ventilation system vibrating or something like that. But then, just as I started to doubt myself, I heard something else. Not a knock this time. A faint, continuous scratching, like fingernails dragging across metal from the inside. When I finally saw the red and blue lights reflecting off the concrete walls, I felt a brief wave of relief. 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car, one older, with a tired expression, and a younger woman who held her flashlight tightly. I quickly explained what had happened and led them to the unit. They exchanged a glance before one of them knocked hard on the metal. "If there's someone in there, step back from the door," the older officer said. No response. Not a sound. For a second, I thought this was going to turn into one of those embarrassing situations where I had called the police for nothing. But then, 3 knocks. Fast. Desperate. The younger officer didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy-duty bolt cutter from the trunk while her partner drew his gun, ready for anything. I stood there, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. When the padlock snapped and fell to the ground with a dull clang, the officer yanked the door open in one swift motion. What we saw inside is something I will never forget. A woman, tied up, eyes wide in terror, her face smeared with dust and sweat, duct tape over her mouth, thick ropes binding her wrists and ankles. She could barely keep her head up. The air inside the unit was suffocating, a mix of rust, mildew, and something sour I didn't want to identify. The female officer rushed to untie her, while the other officer called for an ambulance. My stomach twisted. I had expected to find a trapped animal, or, at worst, a homeless person who had broken in. But this was a nightmare. The woman could barely speak, her cracked lips moving without sound. The officer carefully pulled the tape from her mouth, and the first thing that came out was a strangled sob. She was shaking so badly I thought she might pass out. As the officer tried to calm her, her partner inspected the inside of the unit. There were no boxes, no furniture, nothing but an almost empty water bottle and scuff marks on the floor, as if someone had been dragging their feet around. "She's been here for days," the officer muttered. That thought made my stomach drop. How had no one noticed before? How had no one heard anything? The ambulance arrived within minutes, and the paramedics rushed to treat her. We found out later that she had been reported missing 3 days earlier. 3 days locked in there, in the dark, not knowing if anyone would find her. That made me sick. Who the hell does something like that? What made it even worse was that the unit had been rented under a fake name. Whoever put her there had made sure to cover their tracks. But there was one clue. The officer checked the security footage and found something chilling. Just hours before, a hooded man had appeared on the recording, walking up to the unit and leaving minutes later. No rush. Like he knew no one would check. The case went to the detectives, but as far as I know, they never identified the man from the footage. His face never showed clearly on the cameras, and the fingerprints inside the unit only belonged to the victim or previous renters. After that night, I never saw my job the same way again. Before, I used to think of the empty corridors as something dull, repetitive. Now every locked door made me wonder what could be hidden behind it. How long could someone be trapped, waiting to be found? How many other places like this exist where no one bothers to check the strange noises in the middle of the night? I still think about it every time I pass the unit where she was found. Today, there's a new padlock, a new name on the rental list, probably storing nothing more than old furniture or forgotten documents. But every time the wind blows and rattles the metal doors, I remember that night, those 3 knocks. And I wonder, if I hadn't stopped to listen, would it have been just another meaningless sound in the dark? I've always been a bit paranoid. Ever since I was a kid, I had this habit of checking if the doors were locked at least 3 times before going to bed. My apartment was small, a rented single-story house with a basement I never used, more of a storage space than anything else. I had been living alone for about a year and enjoyed my quiet routine, until that night. It all started with a strange noise coming from the basement. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe the wind, maybe the old wooden floor adjusting to the temperature, but then I heard it again. A soft, muffled sound, like plastic being crumpled. I stood still for a moment, trying to listen more carefully. The clock on the wall read 2:43 a.m., and I was in the living room, finishing an episode of a series. My heart started beating faster. It didn't make sense. I lived alone, had no pets, and never left anything lying around in the basement. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, even though I knew I wouldn't go down there alone. I walked up to the basement door and stood there, trying to decide what to do. That's when I heard another noise. Something scraping against the concrete, like a box being moved or something dragging across the floor. This time, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I swallowed hard and did the only thing that made sense. I called the police. I tried to sound calm, but my voice was shaking. I explained that I was hearing strange noises and was absolutely certain it wasn't an animal. The dispatcher told me to lock the basement door and stay somewhere safe until the officers arrived. I did exactly that. I pushed a small cabinet in front of the door and went to the kitchen, holding my phone tight, my eyes fixed on the basement entrance. The silence stretched on for a while, making me even more nervous. The idea that someone could be down there, quietly listening, sent a wave of dread through me. The officers arrived in less than 10 minutes. 2 men in uniform knocked on the door and asked if I was okay. I quickly let them in and explained everything. They checked the locks, examined the windows, and one of them went straight to the basement door. I hesitated before unlocking it, but the officer's serious expression gave me a bit of confidence. He went down first, his powerful flashlight sweeping across the dark space. I followed from a distance, stopping at the top of the stairs. The air was thick with the smell of mold and dust, making the place feel even more unsettling at that hour. It didn't take long for one of the officers to notice something strange in the corner of the basement, a small pile of crumpled food wrappers. My heart pounded. I had never spent much time in the basement to know if those had always been there, but I was sure I hadn't left them. They were from chips and granola bars, things I usually bought but always kept in the kitchen cabinets. One of the officers looked at me with a serious expression and asked if anyone else had access to the house. I told him no. No boyfriend, no close friends with a spare key. I was completely alone. The second officer crouched down and examined the floor around the wrappers. That's when he noticed it. Behind a shelf leaning against the wall, there was a hole. Small, discreet, but big enough for someone to squeeze through. They carefully moved the shelf, and an icy wave of fear ran through me when I saw what was on the other side. A tunnel, a narrow space leading straight into the walls of the house. The concrete had scratch marks, as if someone had passed through multiple times. The musty, dirty smell grew stronger as one of the officers pointed his flashlight inside. The tunnel was tight, dark, but I could see that it stretched far beyond the flashlight's reach. My stomach twisted. I wanted to believe it was just part of the house's structure, but a part of me already knew the truth. Someone had been living there. One of the officers grabbed his radio and called for backup. The other kept examining the space, trying to see how deep it went. I could barely breathe. My mind flooded with a million questions, and worse, the terrifying realization that if I hadn't heard that noise tonight, this person could have kept living there, unnoticed. I felt sick. A deep chill crept through me as I thought about all the nights I had slept here, completely vulnerable, while someone moved through the walls of my own house. The idea that they might have stepped out while I was sleeping made my hands tremble. Then, the officer pointed at something on the ground. A knife. Small, rusted, but definitely a knife. It was lying there, just a few inches from the hole. My eyes widened, and I instinctively stepped back. The officer picked it up carefully, examining it under the flashlight. "I think we found more than just an intruder," he said, his voice low but heavy with meaning. My entire body shuddered. That thing, that man who had been there, wasn't just hiding. He was waiting. Backup arrived in less than 5 minutes. 2 more officers entered the house, while the first ones continued searching the basement. One of them tried to shine his flashlight deeper into the tunnel, but the darkness seemed to swallow the beam entirely. They decided they had to go in. I stayed in the kitchen, hugging my arms, trying to convince myself that this was all just a misunderstanding. Maybe it was just a homeless person who had found a way to escape the cold. Maybe someone had used that space years ago and just left the food wrappers behind. But then I heard quick, shuffling footsteps, a dry sound like something dragging itself through the tunnel in a hurry. The officers moved instantly. One of them tried to crawl inside, but the space was too tight for a quick chase. Another ran outside, trying to anticipate where the tunnel might lead. My heart felt like it was about to explode. It didn't take long before I heard a muffled yell from the backyard. I ran to the door, ignoring the adrenaline rush that made me dizzy. On the ground, right by the fence, 2 officers were holding a man down. He was thin, his face covered in dust and grime, his eyes wide like a cornered animal. His clothes were torn, caked in dirt. But what really terrified me was something else. He was staring straight at me, a locked, intense gaze, like he knew me. One of the officers noticed and stepped between us. The man started mumbling something, low at first, then louder as they tightened the handcuffs around his wrists. I stood frozen, trying to make out the words. Only when I really focused did I understand what he was saying. He was repeating over and over, "Did you see me? Did you see me?" With each repetition, his voice became more frantic, more desperate, until the officers shoved him into the patrol car and slammed the door shut. I remained on my porch, unable to move, feeling a deep, crawling dread settle in my stomach. I couldn't answer him. I couldn't say anything. The truth was, I didn't know what he meant. And worse, I didn't want to know. After that night, I never slept the same way again. The officers did a full inspection of the house and sealed the hole in the basement, but the feeling of being watched never really left. I moved out a few weeks later, leaving behind anything that reminded me of what had happened. But sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night, his voice echoing in my head. "Did you see me? Did you see me?" I don't know how long he had been there, hidden, living in the dark corners of my home. But I do know that, at some point, he wanted me to find out. I've been a detective for almost 15 years. I've worked on all kinds of cases, murders, disappearances, fraud, and I've learned never to dismiss anything as a coincidence. But there's one case in particular that still haunts me. It happened a few years ago when I was assigned to the missing persons unit. It was a cold October night, and I was about to leave the office when the phone rang. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something made me pick up. On the other end of the line, a low, raspy, almost mechanical voice gave me a set of coordinates and a warning. "That's where you'll find what you're looking for. He's there, but be careful with what you'll see." Before I could ask anything, the call ended. That week, we had been investigating the disappearance of a man named Mark Evans, a 34-year-old software engineer who had vanished without a trace. The last time anyone saw him was at a convenience store 3 days earlier. No activity on his bank account, phone turned off. His girlfriend was desperate, insisting he would never just disappear without a word. With barely any leads, the call caught me off guard. I jotted down the coordinates and, as absurd as it seemed, decided to check them out. I called my partner Lewis, and half an hour later, we were on our way, accompanied by a patrol unit. The location was a remote area, a patch of woods on the outskirts of town, near a lake that had been the site of a few tragedies in the past. We arrived just after midnight, our headlights cutting through the darkness between the trees. The silence was absolute, like the entire forest was holding its breath. As soon as we stepped out of the car, the damp smell of wet earth and decaying leaves hit us. We walked for a few minutes, following the GPS coordinates, until one of the officers suddenly stopped. Here. We pointed our flashlights at the ground and, between the vegetation, we found the body. It was Mark Evans. His condition was exactly as the voice had described. Lying face down, clothes torn, a deep gash across his throat. His eyes were wide open, mouth slightly ajar, as if his last expression had been a silent scream. The strange thing was that the body had been there long enough to show advanced decomposition, which made no sense considering he had only been missing for 3 days. But that wasn't even the most unsettling part. When we tried to trace the call, the number that had contacted me belonged to Mark himself. His phone was found in his jacket pocket, turned off, battery completely drained. Our first thought was that someone had used Mark's phone to make the call. But there was a problem. The carrier's records showed that the last outgoing call from that number had been 3 days ago, the exact day he disappeared. No activity after that. On top of that, forensics confirmed that the phone had been out of battery for days. If someone had used it to call me, they would have had to charge it first. But there was no charger near the body, no signs that the phone had been tampered with, which meant that somehow I had received a call from a dead man's phone. Lewis and I drove back to the station in silence. The crime scene was secured, forensics started their work, and the officers searched for any clues about how the body got there. But the question I couldn't shake was, who made that call? Who knew exactly where Mark was, down to the details we hadn't even discovered yet? And why use the victim's own number? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a killer messing with the police. Maybe a technical glitch. But deep down, I knew something was seriously wrong. The following days only made things weirder. Forensics confirmed that Mark had died around noon on the day he disappeared. The timeline matched his decomposition, but that made it impossible for him to have made that call. Even if someone had used his phone, it didn't explain the precise details about the body or the fact that there was no record of the call on the carrier's system, only on my phone's call history. Like the call had come from nowhere. I started losing sleep. I had nightmares about Mark standing in the middle of the forest, staring at me with those dead eyes. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd wake up certain that my phone was vibrating. But when I checked, there was nothing. Then something even more disturbing happened. 2 weeks later, with the case still unsolved, I was leaving the station when I saw something reflected on my phone screen. I can't explain what it was, but it looked like a shadow, too fast for me to register, like someone was standing right behind me. I turned around so quickly I almost lost my balance, but there was no one there. My heart was racing, and in that instant, my phone started ringing. The same number, Mark's number. I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end, and for a second, my mind refused to process what was happening. My phone was still vibrating in my hand, the screen glowing with Mark Evans' name. I knew I shouldn't answer. Every instinct in me screamed to throw the phone away and get the hell out of there. But my hand moved on its own, like something beyond my control wanted to hear that voice again. My heart pounded as I swiped to accept the call. At first I heard nothing. just heavy silence, thick with something I couldn't explain. Then, breathing. Slow, dragging breaths. Like someone on the other end was trying to speak, but couldn't form words. My stomach twisted. "Who is this?" My voice came out weaker than I intended. Nothing. Just that slow, raspy breathing. And then, in a whisper so faint I almost didn't catch it, I heard, "He's behind you." The call cut off. I turned so fast I nearly tripped, but there was no one there. The parking lot was empty, just the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. But the feeling was there. Like something unseen was watching me, standing just beyond the darkness, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I got in my car and drove off, trying to convince myself it was a prank. Someone messing with me. But why? Who would have access to a phone that shouldn't even be working? The next day, I had one of our tech guys at the station analyze my phone. He confirmed that the call shouldn't have existed. There was no record of it in the carrier's system, no trace of it anywhere except in my phone's call log. It was like the call had materialized out of nowhere. After that, I stopped answering unknown numbers. But the feeling of being watched never left me. Some nights, I swear, I see a figure standing at the corner of my street, just out of the corner of my eye. And every time I try to focus on it, it's gone. I tried to move on. I buried myself in other cases, avoided talking about what happened, but the feeling never really went away. Deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. I felt it in the silence of my apartment at night, in the reflections of store windows as I walked past. There was never anything there, but my instincts told me otherwise. Then, a month after the first call, I got one final warning. It was just another night. I was at home, reading a report, when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, and my heart stopped. The same number. Mark's number. My hands were slick with sweat, but this time I didn't hesitate. I answered and waited. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, the voice whispered again, barely recognizable, distorted, like it was coming from somewhere impossibly far away. "Stop looking." Then the call ended. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something different from fear. I felt like this was a real warning. Not a prank, not a glitch, a final message. The next day, I closed the case. Officially, Mark's death was labeled an unsolved homicide. Off the record, I accepted that some things simply don't have answers. Since then, I've never received another call from that number. But I still think about Mark, about how his body was found, about the voice on the phone, and about the feeling that still lingers, even after all this time. Some nights, I wake up convinced I heard my phone buzzing. But when I check, there's nothing. Still, I stay there, waiting, because I know that one day he might call again. I've always liked running early in the morning. The city is still asleep, the air is fresh, and the silence has this strange way of making me feel less alone. Last summer, I had a fixed route. I'd leave my apartment at 5:30 a.m., cross a few quiet streets, and finish at the trail near the river. It was an isolated spot, almost deserted at that hour. The dirt path ran parallel to the water, with trees closing in from both sides. The kind of place where you feel like you could disappear, and no one would notice for a long time. I used to like that solitude, until that particular morning. When I rounded the bend near the riverbank, I saw the suitcase. It was lying on the side of the path, just a few feet from the water, tilted slightly, as if someone had tried to push it in but changed their mind at the last second. It was a large black suitcase with a rigid texture, the kind that looks expensive. It didn't seem old or abandoned for long. No dust, no signs of wear. I slowed down, feeling that immediate unease you get when something isn't right. Maybe it was just trash, someone dumping an old piece of luggage. But something about its position, the way it was half buried in the damp soil, sent a strange chill through me. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do. Part of me just wanted to keep running and forget about it. But what if it was something serious? A crime, maybe? I pulled out my phone and called the police. I told them I'd found a suspicious suitcase near the river that looked like it had been left there recently. The dispatcher asked a few questions and assured me they'd send someone to check it out. It took me less than 2 minutes to convince myself that I didn't want to be there when they arrived. I continued my run, but I couldn't focus after that. The bad feeling just wouldn't go away. The next morning, I found out what was inside the suitcase. It was still early, and I was having my coffee when I saw the news on a local website. The headline was short, direct. Human remains found in a suitcase left by the riverbank. My stomach dropped. I clicked on the article, reading every word slowly, as if my brain needed time to process it. The report said the police were still trying to identify the victim, and there were no missing person cases that matched the body's description. No leads, no name, just a body, hidden inside a suitcase, at the same place where I ran every morning. The news affected me in a way I didn't expect. I had seen stories like this before, unsolved crimes, bodies found in strange places. But I had never felt so close to one. I spent the entire day trying to avoid thinking about it, but I couldn't. I had been right there, just a few feet away from that body, completely unaware. Who had put that suitcase there? And why? Why that specific spot? I had run that trail hundreds of times and never seen anything like it. It wasn't the kind of place where people dumped trash or abandoned things. The suitcase had been left there on purpose. That's when I remembered something strange. The day before I found the suitcase, I had noticed tire tracks on the trail. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It could have been from a bike, maybe even a maintenance cart for the park. But now, after reading the news, it felt like an important detail. If someone dumped the suitcase there, they probably used a car. I looked for surveillance footage in the area, trying to see if there was anything the police might have missed. But there was nothing beyond what had already been reported. A dark car stopping for less than 30 seconds before driving off. Nothing that could help identify who was inside. That image stayed in my head. Someone drove there in the middle of the night, popped the trunk, dragged that heavy suitcase to the edge of the trail, and left as if nothing had happened. 30 seconds. That was enough time to open the suitcase, change their mind, and leave the body there without worrying if someone would see them, which meant they weren't afraid of being caught. That made me think. Was this the first time? Had other suitcases been left there before, unnoticed? And worse, would there be more? The thought made me sick. I avoided the park for the next week. I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid, but something inside me told me I wasn't. Some nights, when I turned over in bed, I felt the same uneasiness I had when I first saw the suitcase, like I knew this wasn't over. It was only when I finally worked up the courage to run there again that I noticed the most unsettling detail. The suitcase was gone, obviously, but something about the ground where it had been was different. Footprints. And they weren't from the police. Someone had been back. The dirt was disturbed, like someone had stood there for a while. These weren't the police's footprints. The investigators had taped off the area, and their prints were more organized. These footprints were solitary, uneven, as if someone had returned after the crime scene was cleared. I looked around, trying to see if anyone else was nearby, but the trail was empty. A cold wind blew in from the river, and for the first time, I felt real fear about being alone in that place. Someone had come back for a reason. Maybe just to see the spot. Maybe to make sure nothing had been left behind. Or maybe to see if someone like me would notice. After that day, I stopped running on that part of the trail. I changed my schedule, picked different routes, but the feeling of being watched never really went away. I knew it was probably irrational. I had no proof that anyone was watching me. But every time I left my apartment early in the morning, I felt something lurking in the darkness. One time, while crossing an empty street, I saw a car parked at the corner with its headlights off. As soon as I passed, it started its engine and turned in the opposite direction. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But at that moment, my heart pounded like it knew something my mind hadn't processed yet. The police never found the person responsible. The victim was never identified. The suitcase, the dark car, the footprints in the dirt, everything became just another cold case. For most people, it was just another forgotten headline. But I can't forget. To this day, when I pass by that park, I wonder if the person who left that suitcase is still out there, living a normal life, waiting for the right moment to do it again. Maybe they already have. Maybe there are other suitcases in other places, waiting to be found by runners who have no idea what they're about to stumble upon. And the scariest part? I never told anyone about the footprints. Not the police, not my friends, not even strangers on the internet, until now. I've never been the type to scare easily. I've been a cop long enough to know that most bizarre stories have simple explanations. But something happened to me back in 2017 that I still can't explain. It was a cold September night, around 1 a.m., when we got a call from some worried neighbors. They said there was a child playing alone at the park swings, way past midnight. At first, I thought they were exaggerating. Maybe it was just a teenager messing around or a homeless person passing through. But they were insistent, so my partner Jake and I drove over to check it out. The park was tucked away near a small wooded area, one of those places that looks nice during the day, but takes on a different vibe at night. We pulled up, shining the car's headlights over the sand and rusted metal structures. Everything seemed normal, no sign of a kid. But as we stepped out of the car and walked toward the swings, something felt off. One of them was still moving, swaying slowly as if someone had just been sitting on it. And the air, it was cold in a way that didn't feel natural. Not just the night chill, but something deeper, something that made my skin crawl. We started scanning the area with our flashlights when Jake suddenly stopped. "Look at this," he muttered, pointing at the sand near the swings. There were small footprints, definitely a child's, and they were fresh. They led away from the swings and toward the tree line. We followed them until they just stopped. No turning back, no leading off in another direction. It was like the kid had vanished into thin air. That sent a shiver down my spine, but we tried to be rational. Maybe the kid had walked backward, maybe they'd somehow covered their tracks. So we decided to check the park's security footage. Back in the patrol car, we pulled up the camera feed and fast-forwarded to the time of the neighbor's call. What we saw made my blood run cold. The swings were moving, first slowly, then more forcefully, like someone had just jumped off. But there was no one there. No child. Nothing. Jake stayed quiet for a moment, staring at the screen. "Could be a glitch," he muttered, but I could tell he didn't believe that himself. I rewound the footage a few times, searching for any clues. No shadows, no blurry figures, nothing. Just the swing moving on its own. The creepiest part was how, right before it stopped, it gave one last big push, like someone had jumped off. It was impossible not to connect that to the footprints we found. But the question was, footprints from who? We decided to check the park one more time. This time, I went straight to the tree line where the footprints had ended. My flashlight cut through the twisted branches and thick undergrowth, but nothing moved. The silence was absolute, the kind that makes your ears ring. Then I heard something behind me, a faint sound, like someone running barefoot on the sand. I spun around instantly, heart pounding, but all I saw was Jake standing near the patrol car. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded slowly. Sounded like a footstep. We stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. Then Jake did something I wouldn't have dared to do. He took a step forward and called out softly, "Hey, is someone there?" Silence. He waited a few more seconds before turning back to me with a shrug. But as soon as he turned, a quiet giggle came from somewhere deep in the trees. It wasn't normal. It was childlike, but wrong, like there was something unnatural about it, something off. We immediately raised our flashlights and scanned the area. "If someone's there, identify yourself now," I ordered. No answer. By now, my instincts were screaming that something was very, very wrong. Jake must have felt the same because he turned without another word and started walking fast toward the car. I followed close behind. As soon as we got in, we locked the doors and just sat there, listening. Nothing. No more sounds, no more laughter. But the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there never went away. Jake started the engine, but before we left, he checked the security footage one last time from the patrol car's system. He fast-forwarded to when we had been searching the park, and that's when we saw it. While we were near the trees, a small shadow appeared in the sand, right next to the swings. It wasn't a solid figure, not even a clear shape, just a dark blur that seemed to move on its own. But the worst part was when that thing seemed to look at us. Even though it had no face, no eyes, we could feel it watching. I felt my throat go dry. Jake held his breath. On the screen, that shadow stood there for a while, unmoving, and then suddenly ran toward the trees. But instead of disappearing into the darkness like any normal shadow would, it just vanished before reaching them, like it had never been there. Jake turned off the monitor and looked at me. "Let's get the hell out of here." I didn't argue. We drove back to the station in silence. The next day, we tried to dig a little deeper. We went around the neighborhood, talked to some of the locals. An old woman who had lived there for decades gave us a serious look when we mentioned the child at the swings. "You're not the first ones to see it," she said. "That park used to have a different name. Years ago, a little girl went missing there. They never found her body." Jake and I exchanged glances. We asked more, but she just shook her head. "Best to leave it alone," she said. And that's exactly what we did. We never went back to that park at night. We never spoke about it again. The official report said we found nothing, case closed. But even now, whenever I drive through that neighborhood, I make sure not to look in the direction of that playground. Because deep down, I know that if I stare for too long, I might see that swing moving again.